adult Sunday school leader. A couple of decades ago, my wife's sewing machine had an issue. Now, I don't remember exactly what it was, but something was wrong with it. So I thought I'd take a look. I opened up the machine and I was amazed at the intricate network of wires, and I had no idea what I was looking at. I poked a little here and pushed something over there and put it back together. And then the machine wouldn't make any noise or any movements at all. It was completely shot. She ended up getting a new sewing machine soon after that. So instead of recognizing my limitations and relying on an expert to take care of the situation, I thought I'd take a shortcut and try to save a little time, a little money. However, I spent both more time and money in the long run. So I suppose the only positive from the situation is that Ruth did get a new sewing machine because of my ignorance. Well, this week we're going to continue looking at the story of Abraham, or the patriarch formerly known as Abram, and his wife. They didn't rely on the one who was in control, but took matters into their own hands. So this is the fifth lesson. It's in the unit that's entitled Walking in Confidence. This lesson is called Confidence After We Fail, and it's taken from Genesis 16 and 17. The point of this lesson is to trust God to redeem your failures. Well, we're first going to be looking at the first 5 verses of Genesis 16, so go ahead and be finding that passage. At this point in the story, Abraham is 85 and Sarai is 75. Still no kids. It's been about 10 years since God's initial promise to make Abram a great nation. But wait a minute. God's promise in Genesis 12:12 was to Abram when God said, I will make you a great nation. God didn't mention anything about Sarai. So she came up with this scheme, and which in that culture was perfectly legal. It was legit. It was above board. Now, do you remember a few weeks ago we studied that when Abram and company first got to the land of Canaan, there was a famine. So Abram took Sarai and servants. They went to Egypt. Then Pharaoh took Sarai into his court, and she acquired there a handmaiden named Hagar. Well, when Abram and Sarai left Egypt, Pharaoh told them, take everything with you, everything you've acquired while you were there, and such as livestock and servants, which included Hagar. Well, because of the culture of that time, a child born to a servant in a household could be raised by the mistress of the house as her own child, if the mistress so desired. Well, that was the answer, Sarai thought. Abram can father a child with Hagar. I can raise him as mine. Somewhat reminiscent of a minor storyline in the 1983 movie The Big Chill. But that's not what God had planned for Abram. Sarai presented this idea to her husband, and Abram agreed. Hagar became another wife to Abram, and Hagar conceived. So what we have here is the original Sister Wives story, and there was as much drama then as there is on that TLC show today. Well, Proverbs 30:21 through 23 says this: under 3 things the earth trembles, under 4 it cannot bear up. A servant who becomes a king, a godless fool who gets plenty to eat, a contemptible woman who gets married, and a servant who displaces her mistress. And that's exactly what happened here. The servant Hagar began to despise her mistress. She was immediately able to conceive when Sarai was unable to do so for decades. So Hagar felt superior to her mistress because in that culture, a woman's worth was tied to her fertility. So according to the scheme, it was successful. But just because an idea is legal and it produces seemingly successful results, that does not mean it was from God. Another way to look at this is that not every open door is opened by God. So Hagar was the open door, but she was not through whom the promised heir was to come. Well, in verse 5, Sarai goes to Abram and says, you are responsible for this mess. But wait a minute, wasn't this Sarai's idea? Was Abram really responsible? Well, yes, he was. You know, if someone says to your kid, here, try this drug. Yes, they may have been tempted, but they have the ultimate decision to say yes or no. Sarai presented Abram with a solution. And in verse 2, the NIV states, Abram agreed to what Sarai said. And ESV says, and Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. Does this sound like an earlier Bible story back in the beginning of Genesis? You know, Eve ate of the forbidden fruit and gave it to Adam, who was right there with her. He could have said no, But he didn't. Now, these are not examples that prove that men should never listen to their wives. That is far from the truth. But it does tell us that we are responsible for making our own decisions, regardless of the pressure we feel from someone else. Or it doesn't matter how opportune the situation appears, we're still responsible for those decisions. So Sarai was so convinced that Abram was to blame for Hagar despising her that she even stated, "May the Lord judge between me and you." Which to me is interesting. We don't see any evidence that either Abram or Sarai sought the Lord on this decision. And now Sarai wants to bring God to be on her side. She blamed God in verse 2. "The Lord has prevented me from childbearing." And then she blames Abram in verse 5. "You are responsible for my suffering." Now, I'm not saying shame on Sarai. I'm not saying shame on the wife, but I'm saying shame on both of you guys. You both failed, and failed miserably. But God has used and continues to use fallen, broken, sinful, imperfect failures. And he redeems them, and he accomplishes great things through them. That's where this story is headed. Now, a quick summary of the rest of chapter 16. Abram told Sarai to do what she wanted to with Hagar, her servant, who, by the way, was also one of his wives. So Sarai dealt harshly with her and sent her away. But an angel of God appeared to her and told her to return to Sarai, to submit to her. And you see, she was in the wrong too for showing contempt to Sarai. Then the angel told Hagar to name the child Ishmael. The son would be a wild donkey of a man and would live a contentious life. She also received a promise that her descendants would also be too numerous to count. We now know that Ishmael was the father of the Arabic people. They, of course, have been at odds with the Jewish folks for thousands of years. So now we get to chapter 17. And we see in the first 3 verses that Abram was, how old? 99 years old. And the Lord appeared to him again. So this is 24 years after the initial promise came to him from God. The Lord addressed himself as God Almighty, or in Hebrew, El Shaddai. This is the first time in recorded scripture that God calls himself this. He is God, and all might belongs to him. Almighty. He is almighty, all-powerful. And God's going to back that statement up with action in a bit. At age 99, Abram was as good as dead, as Hebrews 11:12 says. His wife was barren in her childbearing years. And now at age 89, menopause is most likely set in. She's doubly barren, so to speak. So this conversation with Abram is unlike others that are recorded with him. God begins here by stating his expectation on Abram. Walk in my presence and be blameless. Now, was Abram perfect from this point on? Certainly not, but he strove to be. And he says, if you do that, then I will make my covenant between us. And how did Abram respond? He fell face down, a position of humility. And I realize, God could have made Abram's body super flexible for his age, but remember the Hebrew passage said that the passage in Hebrews said that he was as good as dead at 99 years of age. It would have been difficult for him to get in a prone position and then, of course, to get back up. And perhaps I'm reading too much into this here, but I see here that true worship requires sacrifice. It hurt him probably to get down and up. And this reminds me of 2 Samuel 24:24, where King David wanted to buy a threshing floor and an oxen to build an altar to worship God. And the owner, he just wanted to give all that to the king, but David refused. He said, no, I insist on paying for it. I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing. I remember as a child, my dad might give me a dime to put in the offering plate as it came by. And this, of course, was to train me as a very young child to be a giver. But when I got older, got an allowance, got part-time jobs, he didn't give me money to put in the offering. That was my responsibility. If he had paid my tithes every week, even going into adulthood, it would have cost me nothing. That's not sacrifice, at least not on my part. True worship requires some level of sacrifice. All right, let's get back to the story. In the last set of verses for this week, verses 4 through 9, God lays out responsibilities for both sides of the covenant. God promises to make Abram a father of many nations. In fact, it's here in verse 5 that Abram is renamed by God to Abraham. The name Abram means exalted father, And Abraham means father of many, or father of many nations. Kings and nations will come from the seed of Abraham. And this would be an everlasting covenant between God and the generations to follow. And the land of Canaan will be theirs as well. They're living in it now as foreigners, but it will be not only inhabited by, but belong to Abraham's descendants. In verse 9, God began to tell Abraham his responsibility, his end of the covenant that future generations were to keep. Unfortunately, that's where our lesson text ends for the week. But if you might want to go ahead and just summarize the rest of the verses through the end of the chapter, the end of chapter 17, that circumcision was the sign of the covenant. That's what people were supposed to do. Now circumcision wasn't initiated here with Abraham. It existed already. Other cultures of the time practiced that. If this had been a brand new practice, never done before, God would have said, every male must be circumcised, and Abraham would have said, what? What's circumcision? So, anyway, here are some takeaways from the lesson this week. Even when you fail, and you fail miserably, return to God. Go back to Him, trust Him, worship Him. He can redeem your failures. However, that does not mean that there won't be potential consequences. But God's plans, God's purpose are far greater than your failings. Another takeaway, and very similar to the first, is that God uses, like I said earlier, broken, sinful, disobedient people to accomplish His will. Just look at all the imperfect people in the Bible that God used somehow to accomplish His will. Even the heroes of our faith, the patriarchs, they had major, major faults. And God continues to forgive and to redeem. Something else to consider is how this story is a foreshadowing of the Messiah, of Jesus. Think of the differences, which maybe are actually similarities, between Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Sarah. Sarah was very old and unable to have children. Mary was very young and a virgin. Yet both conceived and gave birth to a son who was promised to them. Both ladies, they were visited before their conception, and they were told of the upcoming birth and even what to name the child. Both women questioned what was going to happen to them. Well, next week we're going to have a special standalone Thanksgiving lesson from Psalm 100, and then we'll finish the unit on Abraham on the last Sunday of the month, looking at Genesis 22 and the story of Abraham and the almost sacrifice of Isaac. And we'll see some more foreshadowing of the coming of the Messiah in that story. So I hope this helps you as you prepare for your lesson this week. Study hard. Don't forget to pray for and with your class this week. Thank you guys so much for watching.